You are listening to Tempest in a Stockpot. I'm Christine Bruce.
And I'm Brenda Barrett.
And together we're agitating for change in northern BC. In this episode, which we've entitled Weaponizing Food, we felt it was important to take a deeper dive into how the people who've lived in the North elegantly for thousands of years got to a point where food security was even a problem. I contacted Dr. Ian Mosby, an expert on Canada's Food Guide. Ian is an historian of food, Indigenous health, and the politics of settler colonialism through the Toronto Metropolitan University. And he's going to take us on an historical tour of our Canadian landscape and on how colonial influences on the Indigenous, and the Gitxsan specifically, created programming that removed Indigenous power and broke down cultural significances. Then, Brenda and I want to take you on a quick tour of a Gitxsan food security project that recenters agency in Sikadak, where Charlie Mores and Clifford Capazuto are replanting community sufficiency. Time to check the pot and see what's cooking. Eagles are ubiquitous in northern BC. They're big birds, and to the Indigenous, they're sacred creatures, representing power, spiritual connection, and wisdom. Seeing an eagle, most Indigenous people believe them to be messengers between us and the Creator. They're among the most spiritual creatures we share space with here. In the Gitxsan culture, the eagle serves as one of their 4 primary matrilineal clans. Their feathers are cherished as an important part of ceremonies, healing rituals, and regalia. An eagle's vision symbolizes clarity and the ability to see truth. And these days, that kind of vision is crucial to survival.
So yeah, my name's Dr. Ian Mosby. I'm a history professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. I did my PhD on the history of food and nutrition in Canada and wrote the book Food Will Win the War, The Politics, Culture, and Science of Food on Canada's Homefront, which, among other things, talks about the early history of food guidance in Canada and the creation of national nutrition organizations and sort of an official government nutrition program for the first time in Canada. I was interested in food guidance, I guess, as a child. You know, my mom had a copy of the food guide up in our interior cupboard. I took what it was then called foods, home economics, up until I think grade 12. And so was quite familiar with the food guide and always found it to be, you know, at the time, this would have been in the 90s, a really problematic document. And so, yeah, when I was trying to figure out what I'm going to study for my master's degree, and that was the question that came up with, I think, one of the more interesting answers. And then it led to a PhD that looked more broadly at food policy during the Second World War, because as it turns out, that's the origins of the food guide, was during the Second World War, sort of trying to keep Canadians fighting fit. And it's also this really crucial moment, it turns out, in the science of nutrition, where they're trying to figure out, you know, how the science of nutrition can be used by governments, by armies, in order to produce good public policy. And so there's a whole bunch of battles that take place bureaucratically during this period as dietitians, nutritionists, and scientists are all fighting to define what nutrition is going to be. Yeah, it's the government trying to solve what they at the time believed was a malnutrition crisis in Canada. And it's important to note this is coming out of the Great Depression, in which there is a genuine malnutrition crisis. But part of what happens is, you know, Canada doesn't really have the capacity to do large-scale studies of the nutritional status of Canadians, in part because it's really expensive, it's hard, but the science of nutrition is really new. They're only discovering the vitamins and minerals that we know really in the early 20th century, late 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. So they're still discovering new vitamins during this period. And so there's a lag between the discovery of what a vitamin does and an understanding of how it acts in the body and how much of a vitamin is enough, but also how much someone needs to prevent scurvy, for instance, you know, the sort of explicit signs of malnutrition. And this is a battle because it's, you know, anyone who works in the field of dietetics knows it depends. It really depends on the person. It depends on the type of food being eaten. And so there's an attempt during the 1930s to codify figures of like how much vitamin C does a person need to not get scurvy, but also how much do they need to get the maximum benefits you can get from vitamin C. The food guide is a product of attempting to produce numbers that will not just prevent malnutrition, but that will produce like the highest levels of productivity. There's a formation of an organization called the Canadian Council on Nutrition, and it's led by Canada's leading nutrition professionals, both scientists, dietitians, public health figures, folks working in the front lines in various forms. And this is in the late 1930s, and they're made responsible for coming up with sort of national standards. And they produce something called the Canadian Dietary Standard. And in doing so, they need to base it on something. And they decide to base it on optimal nutrition, which is what the United States had done. This produces a whole bunch of results that people could not have predicted, maybe. One of the results is it turns out when you test someone's diet against an optimal standard, which is an ideal, it turns out people almost never meet that optimal standard. And so the first use they use of this new dietary standard is to do dietary surveys in major Canadian cities. The results, they show like massive levels of malnutrition in all these cities, right? They expected to find malnutrition because people are coming out of the Great Depression, especially in the later 1930s, things are getting pretty bad, but they didn't expect to find that everyone was malnourished, rich, poor, whoever it was. And part of this had to do with the standard they were using. When you create an arbitrary figure that's 100% more than what you need to prevent a deficiency disease, that's a pretty hard standard to meet, especially because they based it also on not the individual, but based on average individual. And the average individual was a man, and the average individual was a working class man, right? And the average individual was in their 30s or 40s, right? So there's children and elderly and all of these things. And this standard ends up creating a crisis. And then there's another crisis, which is all of these early volunteers for the war end up not meeting the medical standards. And the main explanation for this is mass malnutrition. And so people take that pretty seriously. And so Canada has to figure out, like, what do we do? And one of their responses is, let's create a federal nutrition division. And its responsibility will be to fight this malnutrition crisis that the nutrition experts are showing us exists. But they also don't want to spend a lot of money on it. And so when governments don't want to spend a lot of money on stuff, they produce things like Canada's Food Guide, which is sort of the easiest thing you can do, is to tell people it's your responsibility to eat right. This is kind of a crucial thing, is, I guess, in sort of public health nutrition, is turns out there's quite a big political divide between people working on the front lines who know what the cause is. It's people are unemployed, people's wages are too low. There's inequalities within families. Women are often eating the least out of their families. They're feeding the men first, and they're feeding the children first and themselves last. And so there's a lot of quite radical dietitians actually during this period who have been pushing throughout the 1930s for relief rates to go up. Because when you're unemployed, you go on relief, and relief rates are really low. And they're arguing that it's producing malnutrition. And so they argue that relief rates should go up. And so there's a real fight going on, led by dietitians who are probably on like the socialist end of the political spectrum. On the other end are biochemists who are on the conservative end of the political spectrum. And they argue that the problem is mothers, and that, in fact, the real issue is mothers don't know how to feed their families properly. The official response is Canada's official food rules, which is produced in 1942, but it's produced by Lionel Bradley Pett, who's a biochemist. But it's sort of a consensus decision. But we start to see the ways in which there's a lot of compromises made. Like, one of the compromises is they don't want to, in the first version, create like a whole diet, like tell people everything they have to eat. They want to focus on what they call protective foods. They want Canadians to eat more of certain things. And so there's 6 food rules, and it tells you how much milk to drink, cereal and bread, fruits, meat, fish, etc., vegetables, and eggs. And so they give you specific numbers, like, for instance, with bread, 1 serving of whole grain cereal and 4 to 6 slices of Canada-approved brown or white bread. But this is not your entire diet. They kind of recognize that this isn't. They want people to eat more, drink more milk. They want people to eat more fruits and vegetables. Too, there's shortages and rationing, but there's a lot of food, actually. Canadians in 1942 are eating more food than they ever had before. And rationing actually was a big part of that. Rationing was like essentially guaranteeing that the poorest were able to purchase enough meat, for instance. And then we have this food guide, and the food guide is kind of this compromise, and they want people to eat these specific types of food. And they're saying, please eat more vegetables, please drink more milk, eat more bread, whole grain bread. All the nutrition experts are like, oh, it's because of mothers. And then suddenly during the war, everyone who's not at war, there's all these job openings and they're good paying jobs. And suddenly women, for instance, are able to work much more jobs, higher paying jobs than they ever had before. And suddenly family incomes go up. A lot of the progressive dietitians and their allies, they had argued all along that the issue was if you give people more money, they'll eat better food. And they end up getting proven right. Like as wages go up, milk consumption goes up, meat consumption goes up, fruit and vegetable consumption goes up. But this leads to a break within the nutrition community in Canada between progressive dietitians and folks who argue that the issue was always an education issue. And they start to push dietitians out of leadership roles within the Canadian Council on Nutrition. And it starts to get taken over by government workers, but also biochemists and those sorts of people who are on the conservative end. And they end up in the late 1940s sort of scrapping optimal nutrition and creating a new dietary standard that has minimal levels of nutrition that could be used for determining relief rates, and then optimal nutrition, which can be used for the food guide. And I guess this is where my work on nutrition experiments come in. Is malnutrition not getting enough to meet your full potential? Or is it not getting enough and developing nutritional, like clinical nutritional deficiencies? And because it becomes such a political question, Canadian nutrition professionals, particularly scientists, they want to be able to answer the question scientifically. And so they start to seek out populations they can use to test these contested questions. There was no money and suddenly there's lots of money, and they go trying to find populations who are malnourished. It turns out that one of the most malnourished populations in Canada are people who are Indigenous and whose lands have been taken and who, because of government policies, have had their economies destroyed. And this is particularly true in the North, where for a whole bunch of reasons, one of the most important reasons being massive government cutbacks during the 1930s to relief rates to Indigenous peoples, there is genuine hunger and malnutrition in many Indigenous communities, particularly Northern Indigenous communities. They're already malnourished. Why don't we use them to answer some of the questions that we have? And so one of the questions they have is, how do we treat clinical malnutrition? And so they use the populations in these areas to test vitamin supplementation. So when they go to residential schools, this is different because, they're like, okay, Indigenous peoples are malnourished. They have this idea that it's because they've like fallen behind modernity. This is why. It's not because of government policy. It's not because of anything we did. It's because they've fallen behind out of modernity. We need to get them back on their feet. And so there's this idea that Indigenous peoples are naturally malnourished in Canada. But then they go to residential schools. And this is kind of important because residential schools, families have no choice about whether their children get sent there. They have no say in the diet. And the diet is entirely determined by the federal government and the churches who it gives money to run the schools. And in fact, in collaboration with the Red Cross, the nutrition division actually sends out teams to assess the quality of diets at institutions in Canada, like war factories, prisons, but also residential schools, because these are federally run institutions. And the diets at like war factories and prisons are actually pretty decent relatively, but at residential schools, they find pretty horrific conditions. Conditions also that families had been complaining about and trying to get fixed for decades. But this is the first time they send nutrition professionals, and they're pretty appalled at what they see. They see kids who are quite literally going hungry, like not being given enough calories in the day, kids who have clinical signs of malnutrition, and kids who are not being given any fresh fruit and vegetables, who are rarely being given like quality meats, who are eating a lot of food that is spoiled. All of the things that families and kids had been saying for years, and the federal government hadn't done anything about, suddenly these white people come in and they see it firsthand. And really quickly, Lionel Pett determines that the cause of it is underfunding. In fact, during the 1930s and 1940s, funding to residential schools keeps getting cut. And the schools are running on like skeleton budgets. And Pett determines, he looks at the budget for the residential schools they examine. He determines that their budget for food is about 50% of what they need to meet Canada's food guide. And so all this stuff happens. He argues, that this is going on. The government does not increase the budget. he tries to retrain the staff, because another thing about residential schools is they're so underfunded that they can't afford to hire real teachers. Like if you're going to teach at a residential school, it means you're either untrained or you're not allowed to teach elsewhere for reasons that we now understand. And so the same is true of cooks. So the cooks in residential school are not trained cooks. They have no background in cooking meals for hundreds of children. And they require the labor of the children as well. The children are often responsible for doing a lot of this cooking under the guidance of people who have no background in this kind of cooking. And so they try to introduce a training schedule to train these residential school cooks. But it also turns out that there's huge turnover. It's a shitty job. The pay is really poor. And as soon as they can get a better job, they leave. And so all the people they trained in the late 1940s, they go back to the schools and they're all gone. And all the recipes they gave them are not being used. And it's back to the same stuff because the schools are so disorganized, underfunded, abusive, right? We also have the principals and the teachers are people who have very little respect for Indigenous peoples and very little care for their safety. There's massive levels of abuse taking place, sexual and physical. The fact that the kids are hungry, the kids have been complaining they're hungry for years. And if you look at residential school memoirs from this period, the 1940s in particular, every child talks about being hungry all the time. So Pett, he can't get the policy changed. And so he decides to use the kids at a number of residential schools in order to test some of these theories. So they pick 6 residential schools across the country where kids are showing signs of malnutrition. So for instance, at the Alberni Residential School, there's signs that there's riboflavin deficiencies. And so they decide they're going to do a test using milk. And in general, they use the baseline of malnutrition that already exists at most residential schools in order to test nutrition interventions or non-interventions. Because some of the kids get used as controls, right? If you want a good experiment, you need controls. And so why not take malnourished kids, according to this line of logic, and use them as controls? And so kids who are already hungry stay hungry. Some of them get minor nutritional interventions that only address one aspect of their diet. So at Shubenacadie, for instance, it's a sort of a double-blind experiment. So some kids get placebos and some kids get vitamin C tablets. But at the same time, the kids' diets are still horrible, right? The kids talk about eating like rotten porridge, like literal, like there's maggots in it. So all of these experiments across the country don't address the core issue, which is funding, which is the quality of food being served, which is the quantity of food being served. And Pett tries to use these studies to weigh in on these political debates within the nutrition community about how we measure dietary standards, right? It's not about the kids. It's not about making the kids healthy. It's about weighing in on these issues, like how much milk should we put in the new version of the food guide? Should we recommend vitamin tablets in the food guide? At the time, it's illegal in Canada to have fortified bread. So they do a bunch of experiments using fortified bread. They're like, should we legalize bread fortification in Canada? And if we do, what kind of bread fortification should it be? So those are the questions they ask. The kids continue to go hungry. Residential schools continue to be places of profound abuse, neglect, death. And this is sort of where we come. There's sort of one nutrition for quote unquote correct Canadians, like white people. And then there's another way that it gets used, right, for Indigenous folks. And this kind of also gets at this issue of like, what is the cause of malnutrition? In this case, we have literally the government treating Indigenous wards who they forced into these horrific schools, not feeding them enough. Yeah. And yet then telling Canadians that it's your fault that you're malnourished. You need to eat according to this food guide, which is also like very culturally specific. The fact that it has milk, 6 slices of bread, right? All of these very specific things that in many cultures, especially Indigenous people, for instance, there's higher levels of lactose intolerance. So we have sort of a portrait of Canada during this period through nutrition and the food guide that shows these cleavages, like cleavages between class and race and ethnicity. And we start to see the ways in which nutrition could be used as a tool for good, saying like, we should be giving people more money for relief, people should have higher wages, but then how it's actually used, which is, well, let's do an experiment on these kids who have no say and no knowledge that they're part of it.
And just to put a local context on it, this was happening here in northern British Columbia as well, right?
Well, yeah. So because the Alberni school was a United Church school, a lot of Gitxsan folks in particular were United Church members, and they were shipped all the way from New Hazelton all the way to Port Alberni on Vancouver Island. And so I visited Kispiox, for instance, and talked to survivors of these experiments. And this was the memory that people had, was being hungry all the time. Alberni was notorious for the lack of food. And I talked to a lot of folks who would sneak away from the school and go to the dump and eat garbage from the dump to get enough food. I'm talking about little kids digging through the dump to find like rotten apples. But talking to the survivors has been pretty eye-opening, because I've heard a lot of, this was just one thing, right? The experiment was never the worst thing that happened to any of these kids. And then to remember that the food guide was then used by social workers to pathologize families. This idea that, well, your kids are hungry, it's because you're not feeding them according to the food guide. This would be another reason why in the 60s, Indigenous families would have their kids taken away and scooped. And this idea too that malnutrition is the product of faulty education. One of the things I found, I worked with a medical anthropologist, Dr. Tracy Galloway, because when I visited communities, they'd always ask me, like, what did these experiments do to me? Like, what did they do to my health? And I always said that the experiment itself didn't do anything because you were already malnourished. That was what did something to you. And so we did a study in which we looked at the diets of what people have reported consuming in residential schools. And we found that the level of malnutrition was sort of comparable to people who have been exposed to like famine situations, right? Not enough calories per day, not getting enough nutrients, but over prolonged periods. And so the health outcomes of that are all sorts of things that people for a long time were told was a product of them not being educated and not eating correctly. So we have higher rates of obesity, higher rates of type 2 diabetes, higher rates of metabolic syndrome, higher rates of heart disease. All of these things are a product of prolonged nutritional deficiency during childhood. And so it turns out those are all things that Indigenous communities experience at a higher rate. And then we have for years people being told, well, it's because you're not eating right, even though this is a byproduct of the structural conditions that they survived. And also, one thing we point out is children were taken away from really young age, like 3-4 years old in some cases, and then kept at these schools for 8-10 years. Those are the years where you learn how to eat. Mm-hmm. Those are the years where you learn a relationship with food. And these children were placed in places where they're being fed the same thing every day in, day out. The food was rotten. The food tasted horrible. Food was being used as a form of punishment. Like one of the most common punishments at residential schools is to go without meals, right? And you're already hungry. And this kind of stuff was really common. And so you have people's relationship with food being broken in a really profound way. And then they get out of residential schools and lo and behold, they don't have the skills to cook and to eat properly because they were never taught. But also food became, if you talk to folks who've survived poverty and famine, when you're hungry for that long, you develop eating disorders effectively. And I talked to families who were like this. Their parents would never let them not eat what was on their plate, right? They always had to, no matter how much it was. And so you develop all these disordered eating habits that you pass on to your children. But it turns out that, especially for women, if you experience prolonged malnutrition as a child, you will also genetically pass on some of those issues that you face to your children, right? So your children will have higher rates of type 2 diabetes, of obesity. You'll have higher rates of problem births. You think about people whose bones are developing and are facing malnutrition. Turns out it's really important if you want to have, pelvic development, if you're going to have children in the future. And the horrors of hunger and starvation don't just end when you get enough food. It just keeps going throughout the rest of your life. Here, then, we have the ways in which all the nutrition advice, all the food guidance or whatever, if you're facing these structural conditions, it's meaningless. And then it can be used to punish you. It can be used to take your children away by social workers. At this point, the issue, once again, is not the kind of malnutrition that people are experiencing in the 40s. We're looking at people who are malnourished because the foods they can afford, and this is in terms of income, like what foods can you afford to buy, but also time. And this is the one that I've when I wrote this book, this was the crucial thing, was like women were doing all of the work, and the amount of time they spent cooking, it was much harder to cook back then. And so people were spending hours and hours of unpaid labor in the kitchen. And if you look at people's lives now, the amount of time they have to actually cook realistically. And so when you tell somebody you need to eat healthier, you're sometimes giving them an impossible situation, right? And you're saying, oh, here's some easy recipes. And they're like, well, when do I develop the skills to be able to do that? And also, I'm so tired, I'm so stressed. It's cheaper for me to like go out and buy something.
Even as we start to educate people, the bone broths have become the thing about the superfood, right? But that being able to find a farmer, have your own bones, make your own bone broth might be cheaper, but than buying it off the grocery store shelf. But it's the time to do all that, right? And so there's a privilege, whether it's of time and money.
And this is pretty crucial, right? When you have people working multiple jobs, when you have them working in these precarious jobs too, which are like odd hours, the first thing to go is your ability to like spend that time you need, because the time also is like shopping. Do you live in an area where you can actually buy fresh food? Like many Canadians don't. Many Canadians don't have transportation options. If you don't own a car, it is a lot harder to eat healthy than if you do own a car. And then, are you Indigenous? Do you live in a community that is facing all of this structural racism on a daily basis? And then you don't have access to fresh foods. And, you know, my position always is hunger and malnutrition is a structural issue first and foremost. And in fact, if you give people the resources they need in terms of time and income, then you can start to teach them. But you can't teach somebody if they don't have any of those things.
You are listening to Tempest in a Stockpot, agitating for change in Northern BC. I'm Christine Bruce.
And I'm Brenda Barrett.
In the first half of this episode, Dr. Ian Mosby explained how Canada's Food Guide got its start and the nefarious ways in which it was used to impose the settler agenda on Northern First Nations communities. Up next, we'll discuss both Band-Aid and permanent solutions to the food security crisis that our history has contributed to. And then Ian will offer some advice for how the average Canadian can lobby for real change. To end this episode, Brenda and I want to share some brief comments we heard from two Indigenous men who are mixing modern ways into the traditional Gitsan meals and the pride they feel at feeding their communities. It's a remarkable outcome, and just like the eagle, a symbol of rising above historical wrongs.
I teach food history class and I make my students cook. It's one of their projects. And sometimes the student will tell me this is like the first time I ever used a stove. But that's something that's like pretty crucial, is that basic competency of like, do you know how to use a stove? Do you know basic cooking methods? Do you know how to chop? Like all of these things. And that's like education that has to come at and early on in kids' lives.
So what would you say the average Canadian should do about this? Like what advice would you give people?
Well, they need to push for better policy. They need to push for things like a national school lunch program. They need to like stop electing people who are destroying public education. They need to push for people in poverty to have like a decent welfare state that provides them with the resources they need, right? If you look at people in Ontario who are on disability supports for an old age security, who are receiving welfare, those payments are not enough to pay for rent, let alone healthy food. So like, how do we expect at-risk people and their children to be healthy when this is the conditions they live in? Or even people who are working poor, you know, parents working multiple jobs, how are they expected to feed their kids properly when they can barely make ends meet, when they don't have the time because of the kinds of hours that they're working and the conditions they're working under? For me, that always has to come first. Like, this is a core public policy issue of like making sure people have living wages, are being given, you know, we have a real social security system, but all of this is collapsing and it's all being cut back and our education system's being gutted. And I work in the university sector, and I can tell you universities are being gutted. Colleges in Ontario are closing. 10,000 college professors have just been laid off.
Wow.
I bet you a huge portion of those are folks who are teaching in sort of like food and dietetics. So it's much more complicated than just like the food guide. It's like the food guide is fine if it's in the context of you can afford food and you have the time to like learn these skills.
It's very complicated, isn't it?
It is. Although in one sense it's simple. It's like we need to like fight back against austerity, which this is how we're currently being governed in every province. Doesn't matter which political party is in power. BC is experiencing austerity, and you have a supposedly left-wing government. Ontario is experiencing austerity. We have a right-wing government, and it looks kind of the same. Yeah. So this goes, beyond left and right. So this is a public policy crisis.
But meanwhile, the person on the ground, wouldn't a little generosity go a long way?
Yeah.
I mean, if you have, then can't you share with those who don't have? And wouldn't it be great to go out foraging for local berries and have a community jam making session? And
I think all that's important. And this is like having community, and that's how food should be consumed, is like in community and with family and with loved ones and things like that. But, if you don't have any free time, you can't do that stuff.
Well, and it can't be community at a local level so that we're each for their own at a provincial, federal level. Hopefully we're creating those community values, but then that's where we then need to translate them into, if that's what we believe for our neighbors, vote for the people, put those systems in place that extends that same values to even the people you don't know and meet in walking down.
And I think that like when we form or support food organizations, and we're lucky in Toronto that many of the core organizations like Food Share or like the Stop, they come in with a very specific political vision as well. And they're lobbying governments, and they're trying to implement policies, right? With the Stop, it's around like the treatment of new immigrants and of poor people. With Food Share, it's about trying to support specific public policies like school lunch programs, right? So food organizations have to be political. I think there's no way that you can be an apolitical food organization who is hoping to get at these core issues. And there's a difference between a food bank that is mostly dealing in donated food, which is all junk and cast-offs, and a food bank that is providing fresh food and like a grocery experience for folks who are living in poverty, right? And you can see the difference between, like, say, the Toronto Food Bank and like the Vancouver Food Bank, right? They're different models. And we need to get away from this model of like the poor being given the leftovers. They should be given the equivalent of a grocery store experience so that they can choose their own food, and they have the option of choosing healthy food and fresh food. And
we did that last year with our Christmas hamper program. It was the original, a lot of processed foods and the leftovers from your cupboards. And we took out a lot of things that were expired. And last year I insisted that we go to the farmers and we get local produce and we give people agency. Do you like beets? You can have beets if you'd like them. If you'd like the processed Kraft dinner, then you can have it. And many people said, could I get a gift certificate because I have food allergies? And so, it was enormous, the change. People responded to it in droves. They loved being able to have agency over their food choices.
Well, and it gets attacked in the United States, but the food stamp program, you have agency and people love it because there's some dignity to it of like, you get to actually choose what you want to purchase. Every choice when it comes to like these issues is political, and you need to think about what the politics of it is. And is this a Band-Aid that is protecting the powerful, or is this something that is trying to work for change? And that's a hard thing to do. But at the same time, you just want to do whatever you can to help people who are hungry. Food banks did not exist in Canada until the 1980s because we had a functioning welfare state until the 1980s. The family allowance program was an actual significant wage supplement in which welfare rates were like half decent, in which there was like more supports for folks. And then in the 1980s, when things start to get cut back, like the first food bank, I believe, is in British Columbia, and it was put together by a union because workers had been on strike for so long that there wasn't enough money. And that was like a Band-Aid solution, but then it becomes the permanent solution. Suddenly it's okay to have welfare rates lower because we have a food bank.
Yes.
That's not the same. Like having money in your pocket is not the same as having a box filled with canned soup and whatever.
Where I was raised in Kingston, there was a orphans and widows home, and they did a lot of good making sure that people were cared for. And then that thing suddenly vanished in the 80s, and I don't know what happened to it.
Well, everything got cut in the 80s. It's when everything started to go really to shit. So
I believe we can do better.
so do I. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty happy to see a federal school lunch program being implemented.
Yes.
I would like all kids in the country to have the experience my kid has, which is hot, nutritious lunches. And another thing that's really important is me and my partner, that's like half an hour or less work we do every day making lunches for my kid, because it's work making lunches.
Oh,
and
man.
then making lunches that actually they'll eat. Those are crucial things to think about as well.
We're fortunate, small school, but yep, there's the hot lunch program, and I miss it in the summer.
Yeah.
I have to think of
Let me
one
tell you.
I'm really grateful for that. And even how do we do better with it from a nutrition point of view, and without it being just blaming the local cook who's got a very limited budget. How do we give people the resources and believe in people, because they'll make the right choices?
You know, I keep going back to this, but a universal basic income would be a lovely solution to a lot of these problems.
I think so, compared to what many people experience, which is these means tests everywhere. And this is something where a huge difference can be made.
Yeah, it would be so elegant. Dr. Mosby's research is hard to hear, and yet it's important that we face the realities of our Canadian history, especially if we want to understand the depth of the community response with topics like food security. Brenda and I were particularly touched during a tour we scheduled in Sikadak this summer. The first part of our tour was to view their relatively new hydroponics unit with Charlie Mores, the band's grocer business manager. Then we trekked over to the greenhouse and into the open-air gardens with Clifford Capizzuto, Sikadak's farm manager. The delight these two Indigenous men exhibited was palpable. Localization of food systems, local control over resources and production, cultural relevance, and connection to the land, intergenerational knowledge transfer, empowerment of small-scale farmers, and social relationships free from inequality. At the heart of Gitxsan food sovereignty is this community's right to define their own food systems, rather than relying on global markets and corporate or colonial control. First, Charlie Mores, the grocer business manager at the hydroponics unit.
Primarily, it's just the three of us, because we need to be properly trained in here. Other workers, they went to the head office in Ottawa, and they got trained by the original creators. They take this all pretty seriously. It's a pretty amazing program, the grocer program.
And how big is Sikadak? What's the population?
It's smaller than Kispiox, and Kispiox is about 800, so I'd probably guess in the 500 range, maybe a little less.
Okay. And how many people do you have coming in to buy? Or do they buy it? Is it by donation?
So we have a community fridge for community members, and that's mostly the people that come here, and it's free for community members.
Okay. And is it popular?
Yeah, we fill the fridge pretty regularly. The most popular items just standard like lettuce, and then we try to sell the herbs to the local grocery stores around here.
How is this all funded?
It's a government grant. Yeah,
Provincial or federal?
I think it's provincial.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a beautiful irony that the government is now funding you to feed your community for free.
Yeah.
Beautiful irony, considering the history.
Yeah.
And is it fairly energy intensive in terms of the amount of power going in?
That's one of the downsides, I'd say, how much power you need. And then the water intake is, once you initially install, there's a lot of water, but once it gets going, you use less water than you would say, because you just got to make sure the reservoir is full every now and then.
Would you be able to go with solar panels and alternative energy in order to manage it?
I'm sure there's a way,
Yeah.
Well, and it would be great to see Sikadak go independent. You don't have to rely on anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This lettuce is very tempting.
I've actually started eating a lot of lettuce.
Okay, how's that a bad thing, right?
Changes your diet.
Yeah.
What has surprised you the most since you've started?
Just how beneficial it is to grow local and support local farmers and local greens. I never thought how far some of our food has to come once we get it. I learned it a little bit working at the market, but actually growing the food, it really enhanced it for me, how important it is to do stuff like this. Yeah.
It's an incredibly organic learning process, isn't it? I mean, you've got your hands in the dirt, and you're seeing how much more nutritious this food looks and tastes.
Yeah, it's way better. The shelf life is longer just because it's not sitting in a truck for a week before it gets to the shelf.
Totally loses the nutrients that way. Yeah.
Sometimes we pick it in the morning, the customer can eat it in the afternoon.
Because your lettuce has the date on it, right? And I've had it last for a month or more in my fridge, which you expect that can't be.
How is that possible?
But you realize, the stuff that you'd be buying from the grocery store probably already has been, and also handled and moved so much more So yeah, the shelf life
It's
is
jet
just
lagged.
kind of from, it's jet lagged. Have you heard community responses? Like, are people eating differently now that it's been 2 years of having access to these greens mostly year round?
Yeah, the community fridge is emptied pretty fast, and then the farm is they do their stuff too, and people are just as happy. I think they even used it to help with the hampers at Christmas time. So
Yes!
I don't know how much they managed to do, but like instead of buying carrots and potatoes from grocery stores, they were able to grow a lot of it.
See, the value of that for a community,
Yeah.
there's no way to analyze that except in pure joy. Do you like this job, Charlie?
I've really loved it so far. Like, I think when they hired me, I was more going to be a salesman, business manager, but they didn't anticipate how much time I'd have to spend in here. But I really appreciate it. It made me learn like what I'm doing, and it makes it easier for me to sell the product because I'm actually growing it. Sometimes I'm harvesting it and then selling it and then delivering it myself. So
I'm sensing a lot of passion, but also a lot of youthfulness in your voice. You know, it's like you're 5 years old.
yeah, I really enjoy it. I'm really happy. I've been here a month and a half now, and I'm still pretty excited about it. Yeah, some days are pretty hard, but overall, I'm still excited about the job and I enjoy it.
Well, we want to support people who are farming.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in everybody's best interest.
Yeah. And it just makes more sense, especially with like tariffs and stuff. Like the amount of food, coming from the U.S. is just going to go up in price. Just the better. It's just logical to start supporting locally.
There's so much hope in this story, right?
That's it, right?
Now a tour of the grounds with Clifford Capizuto, Sikadak's farm manager, or, as he charmingly calls himself, Captain Plant Saver.
So you've been involved with growing here on Sikadak officially?
Took farm school first year in 2020, and I think 2023 I became garden manager. I was born in Hazelton. I moved to Kitimat with my parents when we were less than a year old. I lived there most of my life, worked at the smelter there for 28 years, and then I came here to take care of my mom and all that after I was retired. Yeah.
So your mom was here on Sikadak.
Yeah.
So this is a really different career path for you then. Do you
yeah.
like it?
Yeah, I do. I've had a greenhouse of my own in Kitimat for many years, and I helped my dad grow vegetables when I was a youngster. He's the one that really lit the spark in me. And it's so neat to see what was once a tiny seed sprout into a huge plant, like tomatoes, for instance.
So is the community, do they like that sort of thing, or is this like a new direction for this?
I understand when I was a youngster that they had community gardens here that grew staples like rutabagas and potatoes and whatnot. Keeps me busy.
Yeah.
The story I heard in Whitsett was that everybody had their own garden.
Oh.
And then they got away from that, right?
Yeah.
For lots of reasons. And now that they're growing a big garden in behind the health center and the school, people are coming and getting involved, and now they're starting to go back to have their own little gardens in their front yards.
Yeah, it would be so nice to get that, especially with the current situation with the United States. And imagine the prices. It's already like $5 for a bag of onions around here. Imagine it's going to get up even more.
And community sufficient.
I think we got to find exactly what the community wants. I always had this like pipe dream. I'd have a community cookbook, get recipes from the people in the community, and throw in a few of our using the produce that we produce.
I love that idea.
Yeah. Generation-wise, is there a different type of response from different generations in the community in terms of what they're used to eating, but also their connection to food and gardening?
They seem to like the basics, you know, what they're used to, like onions and rutabagas, the root crops and stuff. And I tried a few things out here before that some people really didn't like them, even like red cabbage. I've seen cabbages in the recycling area.
Yeah.
But that's true of all communities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to focus on what is used by the community at the start of the season.
Yeah.
When we pull out the seed catalogs and everyone's like, checking out.
But also you're growing food competency where people get involved with the food harvest and food preparation and choice of foods, and then they become more interested because they're competent.
Well, this time of the year too, because we've got like maybe half the people that usually show up because other people are involved with the fishing and stuff.
Right.
They're providing for their future, you know.
Yeah.
I bought these kohlrabi seeds from Mum's Sprouting Seeds.
Oh, yeah.
And they grew magnificently, and you get like a huge bag for like $7-8, eh? I'm more of a budget seed person rather than like our colored cauliflower, for instance. It's like 10 seeds for like some exorbitant amount of money. Let's go for a walk in the tunnel here. Yeah, these are mostly plants that I've been growing over the last few years. These ones here are from Seed Mafia in Romania. So I'm going to say one of these males is a stud for making seeds. I like this one here, the variegated leaves though, eh?
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. I'm kind of torn which ones to use as male, this very early one or the one with the really cool flower structure or the one with the variegation.
You like breeding instead
Yeah.
of playing.
I've been growing this since 1986 basically, so. These are those big flat cabbages.
Oh, yeah.
Taiwan cabbage, they call it. I really like these ones. And these pointy ones are called Filderkraut. They're an old German variety. This one's called Golden Acre. I like it because you could chop it down nicely and you get like little small heads that'll form.
Oh,
We'll get like heads that big
yeah, look
by the
at
time
that.
it.
they'll come back.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, nice. Oh, the bees are happy.
This broccoli is also from Mum's Sprouting Seeds. Looks like that heirloom variety Italian sprouting.
Yep.
The bees love it.
Mm-hmm. This stuff is Portuguese kale. It's known in North America as sweet thang.
Listen to you guys. I'm like, oh, look, corn, and you're giving me 6 varieties.
These lettuces here I got from the Experimental Seed Project from Oregon State. There's a fellow that specializes in lettuces, and this is part of his 2023 mix.
These look nice, yeah.
I'm going to let some go to seed just to get some seed, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I really do enjoy these oak leaf ones.
Yeah. We're getting corn.
Yeah, little small corn. These are heirloom corns. They grew Luther Hill, Will's Early June, and Orchard Baby. These are the extra plants that we had from the greenhouse, so I decided Captain Plant Saver here. So we threw them out here and put the row cover on them until they got established. This is our overgrown garlic. We got such crappy mulch last year. It was fully seeded. That's why it's like growing our garlic in a grain field.
That's frustrating.
We did get some white soft nut garlic. Delicate garlic here. I was hoping to get some bulbs or seeds.
This.
Yeah.
They're beautiful.
They could be planted as an ornamental in a perennial bed, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh,
You're a poster boy.
I bought these last year from BC Seed Co-op,
Okay.
Salt Spring
And
Island.
will you still be able to, even after it goes to seed? Or is it spent, the bulb underneath?
I imagine
they
the
put all
bulb is
their
still
energy.
growing something.
Yeah. Like, I'm like, can I get
Yeah.
both the beauty and the food?
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
my ideal food. Is
Even
when-
if it's just one of those rounds, as they call it, I'd be
Yeah.
happy, yeah.
This podcast was generously funded by the Public Health Association of BC. Brenda Barrett is my co-lead and the Executive Director of the Storytellers Society in Hazelton. Technical production by Christine Bruce. Music by Elijah Larson. Our food experts today were Dr. Ian Mosby, an historian of food, Indigenous health, and the politics of settler colonialism through the Toronto Metropolitan University. Also, Charlie Mores, Sikadak's grocer business manager, and Clifford Capizzuto, Sikadak's farm manager. For more information on this or any other episode of Tempest in a Stockpot, visit storytellerssociety.org/Tempest. Thank you for sharing this meal with us. I'm Christine Bruce, offering the suggestion from the local food movement on social media that we should all stir that pot, because when food becomes a weapon, community should become a shield. Just like they're doing in Kispiox, in Kitwanga, in Witsett, and other places. Build gardens everywhere.